I work off an old, there we go. Yeah, I don't have the fanciest computer ever. So thank you, Sherry, for backing me up on that. Okay.
So, just get started. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 28th Annual Oak Lake Writers Society's Tribal Writing Retreat. We're sad that we can't all meet in person, but we're really excited about this new virtual format. I think it gives us an opportunity for a lot of people to come together and come together in a new way. So we're excited about it. I hope all of you were able to tune in last night to Joseph Marshall's, great keynote address. For those of you who weren't able to tune in, I do want to introduce you to Joe. I know a lot of you already, many of you already probably know him. He's been our mentor, I think two times, Joe.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, 2 times already. But I do want to read his biography and then, give us each a chance to introduce ourselves. We have a number of new members and a number of new guests joining us today. So I'll go ahead and start off by reading Joe's biography. Or would you rather introduce yourself, Joe? Would that be better? You can introduce yourself and then we'll go around and introduce ourselves.
Sure, that works. My name is Joe Marshall. I'm a Sichangu. I was born and raised on the Rosebud Res, and after circling around for a few years living elsewhere, I'm back. I used to be a teacher in a former life. I grew up with my maternal grandparents, and that's where I think that was the foundation of my becoming a writer, because I learned Lakota. Lakota is my first language, and all the stories and all the cultural information, everything I heard was in Lakota first. And I didn't start to learn English until I was 8 years old. So that was my foundation. And that is why I'm a writer today. And I'm back in Rosebud now. I've been back since last December, and I thought it was time to come home. And I'm still writing. I'm working on a couple of projects that will be out probably sometime next year. So I'm glad to be with you all, and hopefully we'll together learn something new.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Joe. I'll go ahead and start by introducing myself, and then I'll pass it on to somebody else so we can kind of do that, just so, again, we get to know each other. There's a lot of familiar faces, but also a lot of new faces this year as well. So a lot of you already know me. My name is Sarah Hernandez. I served as Oak Lake's executive director for a couple of years, and now I'm on the Oak Lake board as the literature and legacy officer. I'm Sichangu Lakota. My mom was born and raised in Rosebud. I grew up here in Denver, which is where I'm at right now. I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. So we start back to school in a couple of weeks. I've been a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society for about 8 years now. I didn't realize it'd been that long, but I've been a member for about 8 years now. I'm currently working on a manuscript called We Are the Stars, Colonizing and Decolonizing the Oceti-Sakowin Literary Tradition. I presented it in the fall to several of the Oak Lake writers who were able to review that manuscript and give me a lot of really great feedback. So I recently signed a contract with the University of Arizona Press. My final draft is due October 1st, so I'm kind of working on that writing deadline right now, under pressure to get that done. So I think that's about all that I have. I guess I'll pass it to the next person I can see on my screen, which would be Mabel.
I'm Mabel. I've been a member of Oak Lake for maybe 10 years, since back around when Tashi joined, I think. And right now I work as principal. I work for the System Wapton Oyate as principal of the high school, Tioshpazina, and I write poetry, and I'm getting into short stories a little bit now. And I really enjoy going to Oak Lake. just because I got so much great like feedback that helped my writing to really mature and to be a lot better than when I first started. But I've always enjoyed writing, and so like becoming a member of Oak Lake and being introduced to everyone really helped me in that um, respect. And I'm just really grateful to be a part of like a writer society like this. Right now I serve on the board, and I don't know. I don't know. I'm really glad that my daughter is here also. She's 13 now and she's able to join, and she's been writing a lot. Um, she writes these scripts for, I don't know, some activity that her and her friends do together. And they write scripts of different movies they've seen and what they would do in different situations in those movies. So I think it's really neat. And I know she's really embarrassed about it, but hopefully she thinks about it a little bit. Okay, I'll pass it on to Nick is next on my screen. So.
Good morning, Matakapi. Oh, wait, which Nick? Me?
Go for it.
Okay, all right. Good morning, Matakapi. My name is Nick Estes. I was formerly assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. I'm currently taking a position at the University of Minnesota, assistant professor of American Indian Studies, starting next fall. I've been a member of Oak Lake Writers Society, I think since 2013, if I remember correctly. It's about 8 years. And yeah, I started reading the publications from Oak Lake. The first one I read in high school was, or after I graduated high school, was The Stretch of the River, which is really good. And then also Jesapa Woolly Hamble, which is also a really good kind of collection. And those two books really served as the foundation for my first monograph, Our History is the Future, which came out in 2019. And I'm currently working on a book proposal for my next project called, well, actually, I don't know what it's called, but it's History of the Red Power Movement, and looking really specifically at Lakota activists and Dakota activists. And I've conducted perhaps, I'm thinking upwards to 36 interviews so far, and have done some oral histories with that. And I just got back from Omaha, Nebraska, was going through their archives there, looking at FBI files. So I'm happy to be here today. And I will pass it to, I'll pass it to the other Nick.
All right. Wow. I do not have pedigree of folks that anyone just mentioned. I'm not in academia or anything. I'm Ogallala Lakota. I live north of Allen on my family ranch here. And about 8 years ago, I completed the first draft of a manuscript, and I spent a lot of the last 8 years just transcribing, because it was all handwritten, transcribing that to a digital format and then editing it. And yeah, I haven't made the time. I started a business down in Florida, got divorced a year ago, and haven't made the time to edit it. And I think now would be a good time to actually get feedback and try to turn it into something. So that's what I'm doing here. All right, I'll pass it on to, I cannot see who the next person would be. So Chris, maybe?
Morning, everybody. My name's Christopher Bordeaux. Chris, I'm a retired educator. Most of my teaching career was gifted and talented. I'm also a photography artist as well as a writer, and just getting back into my writing since I retired. I was thinking about what Gabby said earlier about writing about all of this trauma we've been through. And I don't like to tell anybody that all the things that I went through at St. Joe's Indian School, I've been writing those things down, but I don't know if I'll ever put them out there. But right now I write stories about growing up. I'm originally from St. Francis. I'm Sichango Lakota, but I'm a born again Ogallala. I'll leave it at that. I'll pass it on to Gabby.
I'm Gabrielle Tateushkashka. I live in the community of Enemy Swim on the Lake Traverse Reservation. I'm on the board of Oak Lake Writers, and I've been a longtime member. Vidamian. Come on. And I can't see who's next.
How about, let me see who's on my screen. How about Tashi?
Sorry, I was doing things. My name is Tasha Gnumpa, Livermont Brondo. I'm enrolled in the Oglala Sioux tribe. I was born in Pine Ridge, but I live in Brookings, South Dakota now. I've been with Oak Lake Writers. My first retreat was 16 years ago. And actually Joe was the mentor that year. And I was expecting my second oldest, and now he's taller than me. And he'll be a junior in high school. So I have had the great fortune of sort of, I guess I didn't finish my bachelor's degree at SDSU. I'm a journalist and sort of a library person more than a classroom person, maybe, or life person more than a classroom person. But Oak Lake really, I guess, sort of finished my, you can't finish your education, but helped, probably was a more useful education, let me put it that way. And so I was an editor up at West River Eagle and Cheyenne River for about a year or so, and have done other projects. And so anyway, I'm the executive director of Oak Lake. I was treasurer of the board as well. And so, yeah, we're really excited that everybody's here, and looking forward to an excellent retreat. And I think we can go ahead and pass it on to, let's see, one of the people who haven't been here this morning. How about you, Lisa?
Wakantaka Takashi, I bet they will be the Tonka teacher. Hamata Kipi. When Chima Kochi dates ya, Wipazoka Waka the Koto Yat they had Machia Scott Hills by Chi, Hemitawa. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Were you able to hear me before that? I just did my whole introduction.
Most of it, it just cut out partway.
Wakantaka Takashi, I bet they will be Tonka teacher. When Chima Kochi dates ya, Wipazoka Waka the Koto Yat they dead Machia Scott Hills by Chi. Naku tunka we chasta tunka you how we chasta tiospe naku de matawia naku de makota yeah you had that be makiapi. I said hello relatives. My name is Lisa Whitecloud. I come from Sioux Valley, Dakota Nation, also known as the Saskatoon Berry River people. And My Teoshpa is the White Cloud family and the Pratt's family. So I just joined Oak Lake Writers Society. I finished my degree at Arizona State University, my master's degree, and my interest is food sovereignty. So reclaiming traditional foods, things like corn. I grow corn. I've done maple sugaring, reclaiming some knowledge that the Dakota people had previously, but because they moved out of the woodlands, they kind of lost that knowledge. So reclaim some of that knowledge so that we could use them in our spiritual foods, like our deer meat, or corn, and our champa, our berries. So I use that in those things, and also giving people information or knowledge, or giving them aware, bringing them aware of springs, natural springs, and the water that comes from those natural springs. As a woman, and that that caretaking of the waters. So those are my interests. I've done a bit of writing. I've done some poetry, some short fiction stories. Um, I'm not working on a manuscript. I know I have an older sister that is writing a book, and I'm helping her a bit with that. And other than that, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to see all of you. Good am I.
Uh-huh.
Welcome, Lisa. Lanika, would you like to introduce yourself? Or maybe Claude, would you like to introduce yourself?
No? Could you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Had to have my daughter turn it on for me. My English name is Claude Two Elk. I live on the Rosebud in the Two Strike community. Currently retired, but I am on the Treaty Council for Chichango, Lakota. Involved with treaty rights, educating about treaty issues, past counselor, teacher. I am half Oglala, so I grew up around Wombly, South Dakota, and come from the Buffalo Hornships Moose Camp family, and I have roots all over. I have the Ocheti Shakoin in my blood, like most of us. So I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you, Claude, and we're really glad that you could join us for this retreat. And Jamie, do you think you could introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Ostasunali'i. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm here as a helper to Tokala. I'm actually born and raised in what used to be Indian Territory in Cowiskowee. Now it's called White Oak in the Cherokee Nation. I run a tribal tarot business, and we work with tribes across the U.S. to build their research and evaluation capacity. So that's my primary job. And that's actually how Claude and I met, doing some work with the lower rural community where we still continue to do work. So I'm really passionate about this, telling these stories in a good way. So I'm just really happy to be here as a helper. And as I shared on the first session, I really respect this is a space for the Ocheti Shakoan writers. So I'm going to just be a helper here today. So thank you very much, Wado.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And then so I think Laniko might be the only one left to introduce themselves.
Imachiapi, Laniko Lee. I'm an Ikajo from Cheyenne River Reservation. I have recently retired, well, not terribly retired. I guess I'm still working. But I've taught at Cheyenne River Community College when it was, and at Sitting Bull College, and that's where I retired. I've been 28 years a member of the Oak Lake Writers Society. In fact, a charter member. As for my writing, I'm a journal keeper, and I'm now compiling a book of essays and finishing a book of poetry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laniko. And then Vanj, would you also please introduce yourself?
I'm Vanj, Mabel's daughter. This is my first time attending the Oak Lake Writers Society, and it's pretty cool. I'm 13. I'm going into 8th grade. I go to Tioshazina. I'm Yankton Sioux, and yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're glad that you could be here today, Vanj. And then just one other person who's here with us today is Sherry Andre from the Indian Collective. You want to say hi, Sherry?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sherry. Use they, them pronouns. And like Sarah said, I'm with Indian Collective, and I'm just here to provide some tech support. So I will be on mute the whole time. But if anyone has any needs, please feel free to direct message me. I'm happy to support in that capacity. And yeah, I am very grateful to be able to be in this space, and will be mindful of my presence as I, like other folks, respect this space as yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I just wanted to acknowledge you. Sherry's been really helpful in helping us, prepare for this retreat. So I just wanted to say, thank you. So I think that's everybody, right? So now that we've introduced ourselves, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Joe. Did you have a PowerPoint that you?
I do. So yeah. If you want to put up the slides, we'll just start with that.
Okay.
Start with the slides.
And then Tasha, you can put those up, right?
Yeah, Tasha should do it.
Yep, I'm
That's
just a couple clicks. All right.
Great. Thank you. I think all of us are, we come from several, varied backgrounds and experiences. But the one thing we all share in common is we live in a world, we live in a country, we live in a state or town that is inculcated with the mainstream culture. And what that has done, going back 150 years since we had first contact, since our people, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, had began to have consistent contact with Washichus, is their culture slowly seeped into ours. And then reached a point, obviously, when assimilation, the policies of assimilation became very intense and laws and regulations were passed. And the efforts were for us to give up our culture. And that's how we arrived at where we are today, culturally, socially, linguistically, politically, and economically. And the primary reason for all of that is because we've been changing to another culture, whether we realize it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not. That's what's been happening to us generation by generation by generation. And people in the mainstream expect us to just make a switch and be like them. And it's, moving from one culture to another is not like taking off one piece, a shirt, and putting on another. It isn't that easy. So at some point, I think being who and what we are as Lakota and Dakota people, there was always some resistance to change. I remember the story of a friend of mine who as a girl, went to St. Francis Indian School, and she got punished severely for speaking Lakota twice. So when she finally got home in the spring, she told her grandmother about what had happened, um, and she was, really still hurt about the experience of being punished for speaking Lakota. And her grandmother listened patiently and said, "Well, the next time, whisper." So there is that spark of defiance that always been there, and I think in recent years, that spark is becoming more and more of a flame to go back to who we were, or shed ourselves of things that have been that have been changing us. So that's what decolonizing is all about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We all have our own ideas. We all have our own opinions about what things are, and I'm sure that decolonizing is one of those issues that you all have, each individually. You all have your sense of what it is and what you want to do or not do about it. But this is what we're going to talk about this morning. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll have a bunch of slides, and this is what we'll talk about. And then at the end, we'll hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have a discussion, and that'll be a time to ask some of your questions or make comments or objections or whatever you'd like. So my remarks this morning are going to be from my own perceptions about what colonization is and what its effects are. And I want to start by talking about Sitting Bull's vision. And what I'm talking about specifically is that probably early in the spring of 1876, when Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's people met in what is now eastern Montana, near a place called Chalk Buttes, and they were continuing to go west. And at this point, it was mostly just Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's people. Sitting Bull had sent out messengers for people to get Lakota people to gather and talk about this whole issue of white invasion, white encroachment, and the white problem from their perspective. So people came. The first people who came obviously were Crazy Horse's band. Crazy Horse had about 1,000 people, and I think Sitting Bull had maybe 1,500 to 2,000 people. So they got together and they started moving west, and other people came, but mostly they came from Fort Robinson, where the other Lakota bands were. A couple months into the process, it was probably in May actually, Sitting Bull had a Sundance. He did a Sundance, and he fasted and had a vision while he was doing the Sundance. And the story says he sacrificed 50 pieces of flesh from each arm. And when he awoke, he reported his vision to everybody. And in a nutshell, the vision was that he saw white soldiers that were called milahaska or long knives falling from the sky, soldiers and their horses, some with their ears cut off, into the circle of a large Lakota village. That was his vision, generally speaking. And he heard a voice during that vision. It said, "Lenachich upelo, I give you these. Takun pena ichupishnio. Take nothing of theirs." The message was along those lines: take nothing of theirs. So, given the topic of the gathering that he had called together to talk about the white problem, when he reported his vision, people said, well, this is a vision of a victory over the long knives, over the white people, over white soldiers. And as you and I both know, that eventually happened. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking specifically about his vision and what that meant. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn of Greasy Grass, we all know the story. Some of us better than others, but it was a victory. It was a solid victory for us, Lakota, the Dakota, the Shahila, the Arapahoes, and everybody who was there. We won. But in the process of the battle, and there were 3 engagements, people think it was just one battle, but there were 3 engagements. And after the second engagement, when the 5 companies led by Custer himself were wiped out entirely, the people came and they took the soldiers' guns, they took their clothing, they took everything that they had, even took off their clothes. But all along, when a soldier fell and a warrior was able to grab a rifle or a pistol or ammunition, that's what they did, and they continued fighting. But as a young person, I heard discussions among elder Lakota, some of my relatives, about what that exactly meant. Take nothing of theirs. And some people say that the people there at the time after the battle should not have taken the weapons, should not have taken the clothes, should not have taken anything that physically belonged to the soldiers, saying that's what the warning was about. And there were others who said, on the other hand, that no, that's not really what they were talking about. They were talking about the ways of the white man, their thinking, their religion, anything about them. We should not take on those ways. We should not take on anything that is from them, their philosophies, their thoughts. And that's what some of those elders were saying. We should never have started to live like white men. So that's what I'm talking about relative to Sitting Bull's vision. And that's an interesting story and interesting discussions I heard over the years. And I'm one of those who think that we should not have been so quick to adopt the white man's ways. Of course, some of it was forced on us. So there is that to consider. But so let's start with Sitting Bull's vision. I want to keep that in the back of your mind as we continue to talk about what we're here to talk about. So next slide. I think that most of us who are Lakota or Dakota or any indigenous tribe, we're not too concerned about decolonizing. Perhaps because, in the beginning, when our people went to Fort Robinson, or when we were relocated from there into what is now South Dakota, and then separated on our reservations, the process of colonization, the process of assimilation was more overt. You and I all know the stories of our ancestors going to boarding schools and being especially forbidden not to speak Lakota or Dakota, and having their hair cut off and throwing their old clothes, their traditional clothing away, and being given new clothing. So that is as overt as it gets. You actually had to be one day, over a course of 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, your hair was cut off and you were given a whole set of clothes. And in some cases, you were given a new name. So that was as overt and as traumatic as possible. And since then, it's become more and more subtle with each generation, although the attitude behind colonization and assimilation is still there. The mantra of that is attributed to Pratt, the one who started the Carlisle Indian Boarding School or Indian Industrial School, kill the Indian and save the man. I think he actually did say that once in a piece of writing. Still is there. believe it or not. And it was there when I was in school. It was there when my dad was in school. So even though people change, that attitude is still there. And as I said, it has become more subtle, but it's still there, and it's still very real, and it is part of everything that we think and everything that we do. It's part of our lives every day. All we have to do is stop and take a look around us and about how we live, what we wear, what we drive, the kind of house we live in, the kind of things we like, the activities we do, and ask ourselves very frankly, very honestly, is that more Lakota or Dakota, or is that more Washichu? And I think it's a question that we need to ask ourselves individually and be honest about what the answer is. So it's there, it still happens, and it takes on a whole different appearance, it takes on a whole different feeling. And as a case in point, I wanted to, metaphorically sort of describe it. So maybe while I don't know a lot about it, well, let's talk about dance regalia. Anytime you go to a powwow, it's very colorful. You see all the bustles and the dresses and everything that is obviously very native, very Lakota in appearance. But I tend not to look at the obvious, but what makes it up? What are the parts of it, and are they authentic? I recall two, I think they're brothers who I've seen as recently as 5 years ago dancing, and usually I saw them at the Crow Creek Powwow, at the Lower Brew Powwow. They might be Kubuchacha, I don't know, but they come to dance, and they don't wear brass bells, and they don't wear anything that is overtly modern. Their regalia, their costumes are very plain. It's not like these that you see before you. So if you look on the left and the right, you see two images of dance regalia, and they're colorful, they're culturally authentic. But what are they made of? What are they made of? Cloth, brass bells, brass buttons, in some cases plastic similes of what the cultural objects were. In appearance and design, they're authentic. They cry out, this is Lakota regalia, this represents the Lakota culture, and it does. But if this were 150 years ago and people were doing their traditional dances, they would sort of look like this, but they would be different in the materials that were used to make this regalia would be very natural. No brass bells,
Excuse
nothing
me,
plastic.
Joe.
No, yeah.
We're starting, you've been breaking up for a couple seconds or maybe 30 seconds. It's not too bad.
Okay.
So we've been able to understand you, but I think it's getting worse. Do you want to go ahead and turn your video off and see if that helps?
Sure.
Just the video, and we'll keep with your audio.
Okay, how's that?
Okay.
Well,
Let's try
hopefully
it.
it'll be better. Okay. Yeah, sure. No worries. Okay, but as I was saying, the question is, and I don't take issue with the appearance of authenticity. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about at the root of everything. How authentic is anything when we look at anything culturally? And these two images represent that. At first glance, they look real to me, and they are, in a very real sense, they are real because they were made probably by a Lakota person. A Lakota woman made the costume, or a Lakota man made the bustles and those things. So in that sense, it's real, it's authentic because of the origin of the one who made it. But I'm talking about the materials that went into it. We have glass beads, which are not authentic to us. We have brass bells. We have cloth. Anything else that is totally non-native is well, as long as it's part of the custom, it looks authentic. But at the core of it, it really isn't. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things I do that I've enjoyed most of my life is making bows and arrows and using them. And on the left, you see the fletching or the feathers on the shaft of a bunch of arrows. And they're obviously white feathers and black feathers. And then there's a crest, which identifies the shooter or the archer or the Lakota person. And the parts of a feather, these particular arrows are this. There's the feather, there's the shaft, and if you can see the dark wrap around the ends of the feathers, both top and bottom, that's how, that in glue was how the feathers were attached to the shaft. And of course, the end of the knock or the notch was hand carved. They may look like they're old time, their design is old time, going back 100 or so years or more, but they're not. I made these a few years ago out of modern materials. All the shafts are shafts that I bought commercially. The black binding is thread, and the feathers, both the black and white, are white domestic turkey feathers. So while they may look like Lakota arrows, and they are technically, because I made them, they're not totally authentic. They're made with modern materials. On the other hand, on the right image are 3 arrows, and all of those arrows, 2 of the arrows are made with willow shafts. The 2 top arrows are made with willow shafts. The bottom arrow is an ash shaft. They all look different, and the top arrow has a stone point. The middle arrow has an iron point. Iron came among us probably starting around 1850. The feathers are turkey, natural turkey feathers that I cut, and that I cut down to size and split and to make it fit onto the shaft. And in this case, although you may not be able to see it precisely, the binding on that holds the feathers down are sinew, natural sinew. So those are totally authentic to the period. And the only difference between those arrows on the right and those that were made 150 years ago is time. They're made of the same materials that our ancestors used. So on one hand, we have, what's changed. And on the other hand, we have something that adheres to how it used to be. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about colonization and decolonization. So let's go on to the next slide. At first glance, you probably all know these are bows. One is a hunting bow. The longer bow is a hunting bow, and the shorter bow is fashioned in the style of a war bow. There are 3 different styles of Lakota bows. One is for hunting. This harkens back to, the longer bow harkens back to when we lived in the forest in what is now Minnesota, and before the horse. And the hunters, Dakota and Lakota hunters, would use really essentially one form of the bow, and that would be the longer one that you see here. It's made out of one piece of wood. In this case, it's a hickory hardwood, and it's totally one piece, and it looks in appearance just like a bow would have, like 200 years ago, 300 years ago, with the handle wrap and all that goes into it. The only thing modern about it, you can't tell just by looking at it, is the string. Although the string is in appearance is Lakota design, is still synthetic sinew. As for the shorter bow, that is what a war bow would have looked like after the coming of the horse, because then the bow was shortened up so that the warrior on the back of a horse would not have any problem maneuvering that bow over the back of his horse, and it would look just like that. But the war bow, although it looks authentic, the string is synthetic, and it's made out of 2 pieces of wood glued together. So it's, although in appearance it's authentic, it's not totally that way. So I just wanted to point these out to you visually so that we're sort of on the same page when we're talking about authenticity as it relates to our culture, any aspects of our culture. Next slide. There are 2 sides to decolonizing. One, the colonizer leaves. And 2, the colonized entity, meaning us, we reach a point where we decide to shed the colonizer. Unfortunately, colonizing occurred and still occurring on many levels, geographically, especially politically and culturally. And it, as I said earlier, it permeates into everything. And rarely does a colonizer leave voluntarily. At any point during the process, the Europeans who came over and started populating this land, they weren't ever going to say, oh, it was our mistake, let's just go back to Europe. That was never going to happen. It's never going to happen now. So if we want to decolonize, it's a process that we are going to have to start shedding, if that's what we choose, the effects of colonization. So, and it's up to us to do that or not. Next slide. Before the word colonize itself became, a common phrase that it has in the last 10 years or so, maybe a little longer. We used to, I heard people talking about, well, we're like the whites. We live like the whites, we think like the whites, we pray like the whites, and that's what it means to be colonized. And both are correct. It's a phrase I like the whites. I used to hear that a lot when I was a kid. And it's in the effects of it are in every aspect of our lives, from what we wear to how we speak. And if we wanted to be really brutally honest with ourselves, we still do have an ethnic identity. We are Lakota. We can look in a mirror or look at our families and look at our relatives and see we are Lakota. We look Lakota. That's the most obvious aspect of us is our skin color. On the other hand, we have become assimilated, we have become acculturated. Assimilated is more of a forced process. As I talked about, it was overt at one point. There were no choice our ancestors had. They were made, there were punishments for speaking Lakota, there were punishments for not doing things the way the Washitus wanted you to do it. Acculturation, on the other hand, is how we choose to adopt something for ourselves or adapt to something or adapt something into our thinking or into our lifestyle. But both have happened. And we as Native people, if there's any of us who are first language speakers, if there are any of us who sort of lean towards living more in the old ways, in the old style, literally, that person or that family would be very, very different than the norm. That kind of an experience happening, that kind of a situation happening where we go back and live an old lifestyle, or we predominantly speak our own language, or we alter our dress to reflect our cultural heritage, that would be an exception, and that would be an anomaly these days. Next slide. So I think among us, whether we are from the urban community or whether we're from the res, we have two very broad ideas about what colonization is or what the effects of it is. One is it would be impossible to reverse the effects of colonization. So why try in the first place? It has permeated us so much that it would be impossible to get rid of it to any extent. And on the other hand, there are some of us who think that colonization is the cause of our problems. And in order to solve the problem, we go back to the old ways. And most of us are in the third category where we had to say, well, let's just kind of have a blend of both. And there's a however you think is your choice. But I think that they're given a lot of situations that are occurring now, frankly, especially with the loss of our language. I think we need to give serious thought. And in fact, I know we need to give serious thoughts to decolonization, especially where our language is concerned. So whatever your inkling is in either one or two of these categories, I think we need to be honest about it to ourselves. Next slide. I don't know when it began. I can recall back in the early 70s when the Lakota language was first taught in schools on a very limited basis. And I know this because I taught it at the University of South Dakota. So I think that was probably one of the first steps. And language is obviously very important to us. And if we revitalize language, we maintain a connection to our culture. The downside of it is, if we lose our language, we lose a part of our, a large part of our tribal identity is gone forever. There are probably, as I said earlier, I think yesterday I mentioned the fact that there may be up around 1,800, or not 1800, 800 ethnically identifiable tribes, native tribes still in this country. And some of them, have federal recognition, but overall there are about 800 different tribes. The sad part about it is maybe, and so the very tenuous maybe, 160 of those 800 tribes still have a language. Anywhere from 120 to 160 of those tribes still have a language. And the categorization of those languages is from endangered to viable. Endangered mean that we're in that area where it's very possible for us to lose our language in a generation or two. And viable still means there's still enough of us, there are still enough people who speak a language in order to pass it on fairly intact to the next generation. And I think the one tribe that is the most viable of all are the Navajo, because they have policies in place which ensure that their language is taught and learned and passed on, not so much with the rest of us. So all this means is that 600 of those tribes no longer have a language and no longer have that direct connection to their cultural heritage and their history. And I keep, and some of you might have grown up the same way. I grew up in a household where the only language spoken was Lakota. My grandparents spoke Lakota. The relatives and the friends who came to visit, we lived 20 miles, 30 miles from here, southwest of White River. on my grandmother's land, and our nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and he was a white guy. But any relative or friend of ours who came who were Lakota, everything, all the conversations, everything was in Lakota. And so I remember that period in my life very fondly. And, you know, it breaks my heart to think that those kind of experiences may never happen again to Lakota children. So colonization, I think, has to start somewhere. And I think it probably the logical place to start with is with our language. So on to the next slide. Unfortunately, losing our language is losing cultural authenticity. The sad fact is the generation of first language Lakota and Dakota speakers are 70 years and older. And they grew up in households where Lakota, as I did, where Lakota or Dakota was the predominant and sometimes the only language. So, you know, it was a privilege for me, and looking back on it now, to hear and learn everything in Lakota. And personally, I didn't start to learn English until I was 8 years old. I knew English words, I knew English names, and I did hear English. My grandparents had a radio, battery-powered radio and every day they listened to the news from a station in Yankton called WNAX. I don't know if that station is still there, but they turned on that radio every day at 6 o'clock, and for 15 minutes they listened to the news. And of course, it was all in English. And so I did hear English, but I didn't bother to learn it. I didn't, that wasn't enough of an opportunity for me to learn it, and I didn't want to. There was no need for me to learn it. So I'm sure some of you have had similar experiences. But now those of us who grew up that way are at least 70 years and older. And our form, the language that we learned from our parents and grandparents, they were connected directly to their parents and grandparents. And in my case, my grandparents were born around 1900, and my grandfather was born in 1888. And so that meant that their parents were born around 1860 or so. So they learned a form of the language that was spoken way back in 1860. So once we lose this generation, we're losing a connection to that form of the language that went back over 100 years and more. One of the things that I remember most often is all the stories, Iktomi stories, family history stories, any kind of stories in Lakota. And it's absolutely necessary to preserve those stories and not to forget that the true authentic form of those stories were told in Lakota or Dakota. And hopefully we can get back to a time when that happens again or begins to happen again. Next slide. Authenticity is important. And given the type of technology that we have today, if it works, I think it's entirely possible that we can preserve the language in its current classical form, that those of us who are 70 and older still speak of for first language Lakota speakers. But we can record it on audio, we can record it by video, we can hear stories told by elders, maybe about themselves and their lives while they're still alive, and have them tell it in Dakota or Lakota. The opportunity is slipping away. People my age are few and far between. So if you're one of those people, then I hope that you give serious thought to allowing yourself to be your language skill to be recorded, and for you to willingly tell you a story. It doesn't have to be long. It can be 5, 10, 15 minutes long, but all in Lakota, all on Lakota, and that would be a very, I mean, immensely valuable resource to keeping language alive. And as Indigenous writers, it would behoove us to learn stories in order that they go on in any form to the next generation, and to maintain that connection to authenticity and originality. And once we know those stories and we hear them from a source, from an elder, or especially from an elder, then it validates our perspectives as Indigenous writers. Next slide. There are probably any number of approaches to ensuring authenticity, which is the same to me as saying decolonize. For cultural stories like Iktomi and community and family histories, nothing should be deleted or added, and that's how it was done in the old days. Uh, that was the rule, and it worked because everybody knew the stories. So if anyone tried to add something or enhance a story or change it in any way, then he or she was met with resistance, and we were reminded that no, that this is the way the story is. This is the way it should be told. And as I recall from listening to my grandparents' generation, that's what they did. And if they forgot something, they would ask somebody who remembered the stories and say, "Remind me how the story goes." Um, my grandfather's father. My grandfather was born in 1888. His father was born at least 30 years or so before then, more than 30 years before then. And whenever he was born, my grandfather's father, my great grandfather, was 18 years old at the Greasy Gas battle, and he was there. And he told what his part in the battle was, what he did in that battle. He fought in it, and he told a story of what he did. He and his brothers, what they did. He told them to my grandfather and everybody who would listen, to the immediate relatives. And so my grandfather told the story to me, and he told more and more of the story as I got older. So by the time I was in my early 20s, I knew the story pretty well. I knew what my great grandfather, his name was White Feathertail, had done in the Battle of Greasy Grass. And as my grandpa was getting older, and he would tell the story because he liked to tell a story, he would come to a point where sometimes he would forget a detail. He would pause, and instead of making anything up or adding anything, he would look to me and say, what was this? What was the story? What did I tell you?" So then it was my responsibility to make sure the story went on in its original form, the way he told it to me. So that was a mechanism that was used in the old days. Everybody knew the story, and everybody made sure that stories were passed on the way they were told in the original form, with all the information, with all the facets of it intact. And that's the one thing that we can do to ensure that those stories are still the same. And if there's anything contemporary, and everything we do now is contemporary, it's to represent and reflect all aspects of our culture, relative to what we're writing about and when we're writing about, what the setting of our story is. So as somebody asked me yesterday, if we're going to do historical fiction, then it requires a lot of research into what was going on with the Lakota in 1870, for example. What were their teepees like? What were their weapons like? What were their clothing like? I mean, you need to get into all of those, and anything you write now about a contemporary culture should reflect what the period and what the setting is. And by that I mean very, very pointedly, a story set in 1930, for example, should not be dripping with 2021 slang and phraseology. That's how authentic the story should be. Next slide. If we are to decolonize, if we are to shed the effects of assimilation and the effects of the white culture on us individually and collectively, it has to happen in several different ways. But as I said earlier, especially linguistically, but also spiritually, keeping in mind that the realm of spirituality includes the norms and the values in which Lakota society was built. Lakota society evolved into a very complex society with a whole set of norms and values, and to the point that we thrived as a culture, we thrived as a nation. We controlled a very large territory, and our different bands were always very closely connected because of those values and because of those norms. And we were a cohesive, very strong society. And the mechanism for teaching those norms and teaching those values and our own family histories and our band or community history or clan history, if you will, were stories. So we need to go back to those stories, and they have to be part of the decolonization process. And for that to happen, the stories have to be true, should be true to their original form. And to reiterate my earlier point, that means telling and hearing them in Lakota and Dakota. No more and no less. Next slide. But here we are today. We tell a lot of our stories, and a lot of our cultural stories are written and told in English. And it'll be that way until, if we ever reach a point where we've gained fluency as community-wide or band-wide or clan-wide, tribal-wide fluency with Lakota and Dakota. But we can't forget the original form. There are still people around who know the stories, who can tell it in a way that they learned it. But as writers, if we're going to write about, say, for example, a period in our own history, whether it be Lakota or Dakota, we have to be aware of what was in that culture in that time period for our people. And the examples are right there in front of you on the slide. We should not use pre-reservation concepts, words, and phrases and descriptors as writers today. And keep in mind that in our day, in our ancestors' day, they didn't know miles. They didn't use the measurement of miles or feet or inches or minutes or hours. None of that were in their vernacular. But in order for you to know that, you had to know a little bit about Lakota and Dakota. But as writers today, and that's the kind of thing that we have to avoid. I don't think it would be very authentic to describe a scene where a buffalo hunter is chasing a buffalo on the back of his horse. He's chasing a buffalo, and you describe that as that horse running 15 miles an hour, because miles an hour didn't exist in 1840 or 1850. And I think, that's what I try to do. It may not be important to you, but that's what I try to do. If it wasn't there in the culture then, in that time period, we don't use the modern vernacular to describe anything. And when we write about it today. And another example is the word telegraph. The word telegraph is the descriptor is what we use for telephone now. Telegraph was described as striking within the iron. And if any of you know what a telegraph is, you see it in movies and you see it in museums, where it was a little metal instrument that you clicked on and it made an electrical connection, sent out an electrical impulse over the wires, but it was one little piece of iron clicking onto another. And so that's how it was described, striking within the iron. And if you're going to talk about a 1870 Lakota's perception of what a telegraph is, that's how you need to talk about it. What happened to the slides? Let's go back a couple. Let's see. Yeah, that's where we were. So, you know, and this is my method, and I do have a bit of an advantage because I'm a first language Lakota speaker. But the rule is, if it didn't exist in pre-reservation Lakota and Dakota culture, it shouldn't be in a story. And the Lakota or Dakota phrases and words coined to describe non-Lakota or non-Lakota objects are the ones that should be used, like telegraph, or eyeglasses were ishtamaza, or iron eyes. So keep those things in mind if you're going to write anything historical, or if you're going to describe anything, any perception on the part of a Lakota, say in 1870 or so. So next slide. So why do we need to decolonize? For the greater good of preserving our language and our culture and our values, and preserve who we are as Lakota and Dakota people. We can't let that slip away from us. We simply can't. Otherwise, we're gonna be in a generation or two or three. There will be Lakota people who are brown on the outside, but not on the inside. They'll look Lakota on the outside, but they will not be on the inside. That's the ultimate end of colonization. That's where colonization is taking us. That's where assimilation and acculturation is taking us. And that's where we are now. And that's what I mean by, if we were to all of us individually take an honest assessment of ourselves as individual people, are we behaving and acting and thinking and talking more like Lakota people, or are we talking and thinking and acting and behaving more like Washicha people? It's a tough question, and the answer can be tough, but we have to be honest with ourselves. And if we as Indigenous writers care about authenticity and originality, and that means knowing the old ways and thinking those old thoughts, then we need to know the old stories in their original form. And those old stories can be very invaluable resource to us as Lakota writers or Dakota writers. And that should remind us that Lakota and Dakota thought and philosophy are unique, and as much as possible must be kept free of any outside influence and interference. And that's what happens today. I remember a discussion I had with a scholar who came from England shortly after I started teaching at the University of South Dakota, and he was doing his own language resource, and he asked me what our word for God was, and because he had heard about Wakantlanka, he had heard, and that was the most common phrase at the time. God was Wakantlanka, and I said the only word for God that I knew about from my childhood, from the words that were being used by those people back in my childhood, was Takush Kashka Wakha. And literally it meant all that is sacred, all that is moves and is sacred. And I heard a lot of people when I was a kid open their prayers that way. They prayed to Takush Kashka Wakha. They didn't pray to Tlankashila. They didn't pray to a male god. They prayed to the life force, the creative force. And that's how they described it as Takush Kashka Wakha. Well, this English scholar wouldn't accept that. no matter how much I argued, no matter how much of an argument I made, he went with what he knew, what he thought should be the right translation of God, and that was Wakantanka, or the Great Spirit, as he put it. So we have to remind ourselves that we are, we can't let the outside influence keep interfering. Next slide. Okay, so I guess we're at the end of the presentation, and we'll just open it up to questions that you might have or comments that you might like to make.
Nick, we can't hear you, but you're not on mute, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you for that presentation, especially the last part. This is something I've thought about a lot, the way that Christianity and Christian concepts have really influenced not only the language, but our understanding of the spiritual.
Right.
And I really appreciate that. And the other, but my question, you talked a lot about language and kind of ended there, and I appreciate that. But what do we make of, also the inculcation or the indoctrination of like U.S. nationalism and patriotism into how we understand ourselves as Lakota? Because the concepts of decolonization that you put forward, whether the colonizer leaves, whether that's literal or metaphorical, or the colonized entity sheds the colonizer, what do we make of the complicated sort of relationship that we have with the United States, especially the expressions of U.S. nationalism and patriotism within indigenous communities? Because it didn't just come out of nowhere. There has been veteran services and things of that nature, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, it's a very complicated question, and I think about groups like say, for example, some of the like Jehovah's Witnesses, or groups like that, the Amish, and those kind of people who have their own community. They have their own values, they have their own systems, they worship in their own way within the broader context of this country, and those factors that you listed, the sense of nationality, nationalism, and patriotism, and so forth. They still maintain their own unique identity. So doing that is possible. The one thing, and we all have different ideas politically about what we think of this country and what it's done to our kind of people, and we all differ in our opinions. But the one thing that I stuck with me a few weeks ago, as some of you are aware, there were 9 remains from Carlisle that were brought back to here at Rosebud about 3 weeks ago, of children, and that in itself is a sad story. But I saw an image of the whole process in the beginning, when they're exhumed at Carlisle, and the remains were put in wooden caskets, and before they were turned over to the people who went there to escort them home. Unless I'm mistaken, on the top of each of those caskets, wooden caskets, was a folded American flag. Now, this is my own reaction to it. I'm not representing anybody else. This was my personal reaction to seeing that image of those folded American flags on top of those caskets of those children who died at Carlisle because the United States of America forced them from their families and forced them into a situation that they didn't want. And then when they died, would not send them home immediately. And I'm sure that they thought they were doing honor to them by putting folded flags on top of their caskets. But to me, it was not proper. If they had wanted to honor those children, they should have sent them home when they died. So I think it's possible. I may be dreaming, but I think it's possible for any entity, any tribal nation, no matter who we are, those of us who still exist in this nation, indigenous people, to strengthen our own cultures and have our own standards, have our own values, have our own way of life as a cohesive culture, yet to this day within the context of the larger country. It's just a matter of shedding those aspects of the colonizer that keep us going down the wrong path, and one of the things that we should change is our form of government, and go back to the old ways when the people, we had our own form of government. It's not that we didn't. We had a system where the younger people were the doers, and the council or the legislature, if you will, were the older people, the elders, those who with life experiences and wisdom were the guides. They were the ones who debated issues and talked about topics that were important to the community or society at large. We should go back to that because the opposite, the other end of that spectrum is when we as elders today in this culture, this prevailing predominant culture, when we get old, we are put out to pasture, and what we know, what we've learned is just goes with us. People don't pay attention to the information and the wisdom that some of us carry. So those are two ways I think in which we can, form a stronger culture within the mainstream, and that doesn't mean that we're any less patriotic to the country that we have a relationship with, but I think that we our allegiance is how we give it is governed by the treaties and governed by the government to government relationship we have with the United States of America, and that's up to the tribal governments to do. But we as individuals, we need to be, I think, loyal to our own selves as well, to our own tribes as well, and maybe first. And we reestablish ourselves, or we establish our own connection, our own loyalty to ourselves, and still function within the broader mainstream. Anyway, that's my hope, and I think it's possible. It all depends on how committed we are to it, and it all depends on what kind of leadership we have among us to make that happen.
Oh, we do have a comment in the chat box from Leniko. Can just go ahead and read it. She says, one of our own was an anthropologist who studied with the colleague, a self-isolated community in Russia who formed themselves as plain Indians of Russia. They use natural materials to clothe, shelter, and feed themselves, as well as learned the Lakota language to the degree that Beatrice understood them.
Interesting. And I think that, decolonization is going to come with benefits. I mean, one of them is, as I've heard somebody talk about over the years, is food sovereignty. And I hear about a chef like Sean Sherman, and then I hear there's a restaurant in Sioux Falls opening up. I haven't been to it yet, but I plan on going, called the Watecha Bowl, where they serve Lakota foods, or hopefully they're authentic foods. But part of some of our problems today relative to health is our diet, and our diet changed going back to the 1860s. Our diet changed almost overnight, literally speaking. One, because the buffalo were gone, and two, because once our ancestors reported to Camp Robinson and then agreed to the annuities that the government was providing, those annuities, the foodstuffs, were not things that were conducive to our lifestyle and the kind of diet that we had enjoyed for generations and generations and generations. Fresh fruits and vegetables and meat, buffalo meat and elk and deer. Instead, they gave us longhorn cattle, beans, corn, rice, lard, and sugar. And those are the kind of very things that began, our spiral into bad health that we still contend with today. So my contention is that if we go back to what our ancestors ate, I mean, we're all aware of the kinds of plants our ancestors ate. We talk about all the plums and the choke cherry, the choke cherries and berries that the champha and everything else, and we know how they prepared their meat and dried out everything and preserved them. If we go back to that and we eat those kinds of healthy foods, I think some of our health problems will not be as bad as they are today. And that's a definite a definite form of decolonization, is to get rid of the kind of diet that we have now. And I think that's, as Leniko mentioned, though it's possible to form, as she said, an enclave within a broader society, and strengthen our language, go back to the values that we had. We can do that and still live here. We can still do that and drive four-wheel drive pickup trucks. We can still, practice the values of generosity and compassion and respect, and do everything else that we're doing now. Because we're never going back to chasing buffalo. We're never going to go back to living in teepees, but we can live in such a way that we relearn and reinforce our values.
Oh, and the next comment, many of the wars of survival were fought over food. The Mormon Calf War in 1854, the starvation conditions that led to the U.S. Dakota War in 1862, and the Black Hills War from 1855 to 1866 were fought to protect the Pute-Oate herds.
Right. And we're on the verge of something akin to that, because now we're buying water. So the next, worldwide battle or war might be over water.
You know, one of the things that really struck me when you were talking, Joe, is that decolonization occurs at many different levels. You talked about our language linguistically, and then now we have people talking about food sovereignty. So decolonization is something that really occurs at different levels. And one thing I always tell my students is decolonization is also a process. It's not something that just, you know, you're suddenly wake up one day and are decolonized. It's something that you have to consciously learn and practice.
Right. Yeah, it has to be a process because it was brought on in the beginning very overtly and very fast, and the weight of it was hard to contend with for our ancestors. But after that, it was a gradual process. It still is happening. So in order to decolonize, we have to understand it will be a step-by-step process. As you said, we can't just wake up one morning and everything has changed. It won't happen that way. It will involve people taking time, making the effort, and sticking with learning their language, relearning their language. And that's a process in itself. And if that's where it starts, and that's a logical place to be, but you're right, it's a process.
And then another comment from Leniko. So just like the elephant eaters, we start with one bite or aspect of our lives to reclaim ourselves, starting with what we is beginning, feeding the body to feeding the mind, thinking in the language.
Right. Right. I mean, one of the questions that people ask me every now and then is when I think thoughts, asking me personally, when I think thoughts, do I think in Lakota or do I think in English? And the answer is both. But early on in my life, if everything was in Lakota, even the thoughts that I had were in Lakota. And still, when I dream, sometimes, you know, I hear conversations in Lakota. So, you know, that hasn't been taken away entirely, but I think that, you know, it behooves us to you know, learn those kind of things, learn the language a little at a time, if that's what it takes.
In the 1940s, this is from Leniko. In the 1940s, an ethnographer collected stories from Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Oglala. Are these resources still available?
I don't know. They probably are. I hope they are. I'm sure that somebody has them in some archive somewhere. There were a lot of people who did that. Went around collecting stories, interviewing people, and hopefully they're available somewhere, but I don't know specifically.
And then Tashi, is Dakota Text a good resource for old stories in Lakota and Dakota?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is.
And Zoom makes the conversation feel a little stunted. Is maybe another way for us to go about this is maybe we go around and everybody asks one question. Would that help get conversation going a little better?
Naku, people look like podcast, Dakota app. They have a Dakota app, Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. Just wanted to let you know it's on, I believe it's on iTunes or app. There's a Dakota app there. There's a few of them that work well. It's called Dakota Dictionary, Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. That's just a resource for language.
That's good to know. I'm glad to hear that.
I have another question. I've noticed, not that I've only studied Lakota in college, besides just knowing a couple words as a kid. But just from what I've seen, like for example, the Episcopal Church, the prayer book and some of the hymns, it looks to me like the language is structured in English pattern. And sometimes you hear people say they'll just go into one of these churches that still speak Lakota or Dakota, and they'll, just to hear the language. And that thought kind of frightens me, because I don't know much, but I can tell it's very different. And I've raised this question with, the leadership of the Episcopal Church in South Dakota, and they just shrug. And Sarah Hernandez she has some fascinating, awesome work comparing stories that Ella Deloria translated compared to these missionary translations. And it confirmed, I think, some of my suspicions. So, how can we engage with that part of it? It still seems to have such a monopoly on our language today.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately you may be right, but my grandparents on both sides were Episcopalians, so I had an opportunity to when I was a child be part of that, and I would hear the hymns, but they were in Dakota, from the Dakota hymnal, and the prayers were being Dakota from the Dakota prayer book. But you're right, it was translated to and then made to fit English speech patterns of whenever they were translated back in the 30s and 40s. And it's a common thing. It's a common thing that people do when you translate from one language to the next. You do that so that your comfort level is not affected. You're comfortable with it. Prayer books and hymnals in those languages and in those dialects are a good source of just words. Never mind how they're used in a hymn or in a prayer, but they're always a good source of old words that we don't hear anymore today. So in that sense, they're a good resource because the translators of the day were, elders or people who had a direct connection to the language around 1890. 1890 or so. So they use the words that they're familiar with, and that's something that we don't use today. So in that sense, they're good. But as far as learning from them, the learning idiomatic patterns and so forth, no, they're not.
And it looks like we have a couple comments in the chat box from Lanico. One of the stories I was asking about was the Slim Butte Raccoon by Anne Clark, illustrated by Andrew Standing Soldier. It was a bilingual children's story published in 1942 by the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C.
Okay. I haven't heard that one.
And then the second question was from Nick. Do you have a preferred orthography? You mentioned Albert Whitehead's work. Are there other recommendations you have for reading, writing, thinking, and speaking Lakota or Dakota?
No, not really. I like Albert's work, and I use as much of it as possible. But being a first language speaker and having taught the language myself, I have my own orthography that I use. And it's probably unlike anybody else's. I try to keep it as simple as possible, but and that's part of the problem, that we are different types that are out there, and really I'm not a fan of LLC and what they're trying to do.
Would you be able to say a little bit more about that, Joe, about LLC and what they're doing and how they've changed the language?
Well, it's the orthography, the alphabet that they choose to use, the manner in which they decided to write the language that is confusing for a lot of people. And the resources are, the people that they've used, if they did, for much of their information, are probably impeccable. I know some of those people that they've listed, although some of us aren't with us anymore. But I think it's the fact, and I heard that, I don't know what it means legally, but they copyrighted the language. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. And in a very broad context, I'm in favor of anyone or any group that is helping to preserve the language, whether it's Dakota or Lakota. But I think that those of us who have taught the language, who are linguists, who know the language, should be the ones who are in the lead rather than somebody who is not from here. But I think it's the alphabet that they've chosen to use that is the most confusing for people. It is for me.
Nick said your next book should be your orthography.
Maybe that's a good idea.
We had an elder that did a lot of language work. Her name was Doris Kraft Buzamani. And she used to say, she worked for 30 to 40 years doing language, and we weren't producing fluent speakers. So she suggested that the orthography was not important as much as being able to say it. So if you could do it in person, I guess, but the other thing would be to do it phonetically. That was her suggestion. Then she was using songs towards the end to help people learn the language.
Right. It's not important to learn how to write it. It's important to learn how to speak it. And I think learning how to write it just adds another layer of stress to people who are trying to learn it. So if we want to teach it, we first have to teach it conversationally, idiomatically, and because that's how we learned it. For those of us who are first language speakers, that's how we learned it as kids. We just listened and imitated. So it's a process that works. So as much as possible, and the people who do language nests have found that out, that the more you hear it, the more you speak it, the quicker you learn it, rather than worrying about an alphabet.
I have a question. I kind of mentioned it last night. I would like to hear, because of the way you grew up, sometimes I feel like it's a little bit hard to speak the female dialect as a professional woman. For
Right.
example, as a journalist, I still physically could, if I was at a treaty council meeting, for example, and I was welcome there, I could still sit with the women and, observe, like do certain things and make me a good relative. But at some point, the ability to, speak directly or do certain things isn't really the cultural way, especially among speakers.
Right.
Do you have any comments or suggestions about that?
Well, on one hand, when I grew up, I heard both. Obviously, I heard both the female and male usages because of my grandparents. My grandmother spoke the female form, and my grandfather spoke the male form, and so I heard both. And as a child, I just instinctively responded to my grandmother in the way she spoke it. So I learned both ways. So that's a natural occurrence. It was a natural occurrence back then for me, for first language speakers. So you grow up being aware of both. And, like it or not, things change. And a lot has changed about our culture. And you know, there's one generation, and my father's generation, that was still very strict about the in-law relationship, the son-in-law not talking to the father-in-law, and so on and so forth. But you know, it isn't as strict today as it once was. So things change. As long as there's still respect between people, I think, you know, with that in mind, I think things, you know, the changes can be good. And I think my personal opinion is that in a setting where now and today, where more and more women are becoming, you know, more outspoken about issues, I think they should be allowed. I listen to them. You know, whether or not they're allowed to speak is not an issue with me. I want to hear what anybody has to say, and especially women, because I was raised by a very strong woman. Both my grandmothers were very, very strong women, and I had a lot of aunties that were strong women. So I carry that with me, and I pay attention to them. And anytime any one of them speaks, I listen. Hopefully, I'm not the exception. But as I said, things change, and I think it's time for women to take their place at the table, as it were, or at the circle, and you know, be equal in all things, as in my mind they are.
I know that my brother would inform the younger boys to use the wo, the po, and the do. Those are the male,
Mm-hmm.
the male pronunciations, I guess. And they would tell them, just don't say yay, because that's the woman
Right.
speaking. But at the same time, when you talk about talking to your grandma, you know, you would respond, huh? You know,
Yeah.
some people think that's a female expression, but that's can be used for both.
For both, yes.
Yeah.
And
I
then we
wanted to ask, there's a logo, or there's a, what would you call that? An expressions that's used for young people nowadays, especially to be successful in college or whatever, where they talk about the two worlds. What do you think of that? It's kind of an expression that I reject myself, because I don't think our young people need to be any more confused or made to feel that they can be separated into two different people. But what do you think of that expression, the two worlds? We live in two worlds. It's used by
Living.
in college fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Living in two worlds. Well, you know what? In the real sense, we do, because you know, I lived off reservation. I lived away from here for a lot of years in different places in California, in Washington State, and in parts of Wyoming, and I saw obviously those of us who have those kinds of experiences, and that's most of us today, because if the statistics are right, 40% of us enrolled members are still in the res, and 60% of us are off. It used to be kind of the other way around, but that's what the statistics say now. So when you're off the reservation, away from any kind of Indian community, Native community, then you're in the mainstream, and you function. You may not think like them, but you function like them at the very least, and you do the kind of things that are expected in that society. And then when I come home, then it's a whole different feeling. When I came back here, it's a whole different feeling. I didn't stick out like a sore thumb, for one thing. I could speak my own language. I could talk Lakota to people who knew it. It was a whole different feeling being here, and so it was two worlds, and we do live in it. But it all depends on the kind of cultural grounding that we have as individuals. And I was one of the lucky ones in the way I grew up, in the values that were taught to me by my grandparents from both sides, both paternal and maternal. And because they taught me about history, they told the stories of family on both sides. And the sum total of that was to give me a really, really strong sense of identity. There was no doubt in my mind ever as to who and what I am. So that's what I took out with me into the other world, into that white world. And that's what really was my first line of defense, as it were, against anything out there in that other world, is that I knew who I was, and I know where I came from. And so maybe that's the problem in itself, is that we do live in two worlds, but we have to be sure what our own particular identities are. And if we don't know who we are as Lakota or Dakota people, if we don't know who we are, where we come from, if we don't know our own family histories, then we're lacking a very integral part of our psychological and emotional makeup, and that's identity. And knowing that is what really helps me to go and function in that other world. And then when I come home, it's a good place to be.
And then we have one last comment from Lenico. A prolific political contributor to our community was Eunice Larrabee, who was an elder orator, not shy about presenting her views at tribal council. I remember well her bilingual presentations, translating her own discussion issues before the council.
Right.
Yeah. And then we actually only have a couple of minutes left in this session. So I do want to go over a couple of things with you. First, I want to thank you, Joe, for your really great presentation. I know I learned a lot, so I really appreciate that. Like I said, we're going to break for lunch. We have a 2-hour break from lunch from 12:15 to 2:15. I'm an hour behind you guys. 12:15 to 2:15. And then we're going to have smaller workshops. What we decided to do this year a little bit differently is, since we're virtual, we want to do smaller workshops that are tailored to all of our different writers' interests. We have, poets, we have people who write short stories, essays, whatever. We have so many different writers from different backgrounds. We kind of wanted to break up into smaller workshops where you can attend a session that better fits your needs and your interests. So after lunch, we're going to have these smaller workshops. Let me pull them up real quick. So we have from 2:15 to 3:15 is a workshop with Joe on fiction and nonfiction. And then I'll put these in the chat box. From 3:30 to 4:30, we have a second workshop with children's author Jesse taking a live rent counter. From 4:45 to 5:45, we have a meeting or a workshop with poet Trevino Brings Plenty. And then from 6 to 7, there's a workshop with Nick Estes on journalism and social media. So we encourage you guys to attend, as many of these workshops that you can, or that you find of interest. One of the things I also want to mention is that during these workshops, starting at 4 o'clock, we're also going to have one-on-one meetings with Joe. Several of you signed up for one-on-one sessions so that you could discuss your own manuscripts. So just to make it easier, I made a schedule based on just going alphabetically, and so we can just do it that way. So I'm going to put that in the chat box too. So like I said, these one-on-one sessions with Joe will start at 4 o'clock. We've already sent him copies of your manuscript materials that you've sent us. So Chris, your one-on-one session with Joe is from 4 to 4:30. Rania, I don't know if she's on here. We might have to email her. Hers is from 4:30 to 5. Nick Livermont, 5 to 5:30. Gabrielle, 5:30 to 6. Claude, your session is from 6 to 6:30. And Lisa, your session is from 6:30 to 7.
Okay, that's Lisa White Cloud.
Yeah.
Says White Elk.
Oh, sorry. I think I typed your name and Claude's name at the same time. And then, oh, and then Tashi said, has everyone been able to use the portal okay? Or does she need to send emails to everybody? Do you guys have a preference?
Can you email me?
I-
This is Gabby, so I know my time for the manuscript.
Okay. Yeah, should we?
Yeah, I'd like an email too as well with the link.
Okay. Can we do
Yeah,
that?
that would be good with a link too.
Okay, anybody else?
Thank you.
Sounds good. So yeah, we can break for lunch now, and then like I said, at 2:15 we have our first workshop with Joe.
And then I will send everyone who's doing the mentoring, I'll send an email for those, but